are often very, very important, very strong, very major ethnic and religious divisions among different groups in these extremely heterogeneous societies, and often this is exacerbated by economic equality, particularly if there's a large diaspora, for instance, the Lebanese diaspora in many communities, the Armenian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia often provides the spark for antagonism. Here's an example of the kind of heterogeneity that we see in these states. So this is a political map of Africa with political boundaries. So these are the state boundaries. So let's take a look at this part right here. There are maybe 15 states or so in this part of West Africa. So 15 or so states, maybe let's say 20 at the most. Let's take a look at the ethnic map. Look at those ethnic groups. I mean, there are literally hundreds of ethnic groups there, and obviously it's not nearly as heterogeneous, but certainly very heterogeneous in other parts of Africa. But there must be literally a couple hundred ethnic groups right there that are, once again, go back here, that are concentrated in about 15 or 20 states. So it gives you an idea of the level of ethnic heterogeneity that we see in Africa, which obviously has implications for the strength of societies vis-a-vis states, and then also for state capacity and state autonomy. You know, how can you build? Remember going back to the chapter 2 on Herbst, who talked about state building and nationalism in medieval Europe. Right, it's very difficult to create nationalism and national consensus within a state when there is so much ethnic heterogeneity. Okay, so generating economic growth. You know, there was a strain of developmental economists and also political scientists believe that less developed countries would, upon independence, grow very rapidly. Okay, but it didn't happen. You know, and many question why. And some argued that it was because these newly independent countries were not economically independent, and this gave rise to dependency theory. Now, dependency theory, you should go watch this YouTube clip on dependency theory, which is very good, and it essentially explains what dependency theory is. And the idea generally behind dependency theory is that the world is divided economically into a core and a periphery. Now, others have sort of developed the theory a little bit more and brought in a semi-periphery, but for our purposes, a core and a periphery is enough. And so what these dependency theorists like Cardoso and Faleto and others argued was that LDCs were poor not because they weren't integrated into the global capitalist society, right, which is what many were arguing, but that they were integrated into that global capitalist system in a particular manner. And the manner was such that peripheral nations were dependent upon those in the core. So what that means was that they provided natural resources, cheap labor, and receptive markets for the core nations. Moreover, that the argument was that without these peripheral nations, the core nations would not have the standard of living that they do. Okay, so they were in fact profiting, they being the core, from the peripheral nations. They were exploiting them essentially. And the core nations, through various policies and structures, would facilitate the dependence of peripheral nations on the core. So they, once these peripheral nations became dependent on the core nations, they weren't allowed to essentially wean themselves off their dependence. The core nations would advance certain policies that would keep peripheral nations dependent on the core. And so there were often attempts by peripheral nations to resist dependency, and there often were many, resulted often in backlash from the core. You know, a typical example, as we saw in the video, was Salvador Allende's ouster in Chile, which was facilitated by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Okay. So now that we've talked about generating economic growth, we have to then determine how we can measure that growth. And there are different ways of measuring growth, but The most important probably is GDP per capita, which is gross domestic product per capita, which is simply gross domestic product is the total sum of goods and services produced in a country in that given year, and then it's just divided by the number of individuals in that country. PPP here is purchasing power parity, as we talked about. Actually, we talked about all this in Chapter 4 when we looked at political economy. I forgot. Okay, so I won't go over that anymore. But what we see is that there are different approaches to Okay, and go back here for a second. So the dependency theorists said that one of the ways that you could wean yourself off of dependency was to implement a political economic system that was called import substitution industrialization. And if you look at the clip, you'll find out more of what this clip back here, you'll find out what that is. Okay. Now, excuse me. What it essentially means is it means to create barriers to the argument was, look, if we as developing countries can't compete with the developed world, and so what we'll do is we'll put up borders, tariffs against these products that are coming from the developing world. And what we'll do is we'll create industries of our own. We'll create automobile industries, computer industries, etc. And we will protect these industries, as I said, by enacting very high tariffs. And we'll continue to keep those tariffs in place until such a point as our domestic industry has grown up and can compete on the world market. Okay, and so what we find is many countries, Ghana, Brazil, India, up until about the mid 80s, early 90s even, Argentina, went that route. Okay, they closed their very high tariffs, and so what we find is that they went. If you look at the 40-year period from 1960 to 2000, this was their growth rate. Okay, not very impressive annual growth rate. Whereas South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and other Asian tigers went a different route. They, in fact, also they went more a mercantilist route, but their economic systems were export-oriented. And what they did in terms of their annual growth rate, was dramatic. So it seems like the export-oriented way was the way to go. Okay, so three paths to economic growth. Once again, import substitution industrialization as a result of the prescriptions that were offered by dependency theorists. Export-oriented industrialization, which is more the a free trade type of regime, and then structural adjustment based on IMF policies. Once again, the state plays a strong role in the economy. You read that. Okay. Export-oriented industrialization, also based on mercantilism, but tariffs were used to protect domestic industries. And the examples are those tigers. So, but structural adjustment is a different approach, which is based on sort of free trade liberalism, things like NAFTA, based on the Washington Consensus, which is a consensus on the way to approach economic development that is fostered and promoted by Washington D.C. institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. And the key here is that to reduce the involvement of the state in the economy as the economy opens up, encourage foreign investment, and this is has been criticized as a tool of neocolonialism. You have the IMF and the World Bank dictating to sovereign states, sovereign governments, what they should be doing, how much money they should be spending on education or not spending, as the case may be, etc. And these are the examples. Okay. All right. So 3 types.